Making a drawing. The very first thing you need before you can make a drawing is a container for your drawing. Now likely you'll have already made a container that's already waiting for your drawing, but if you're like me and you need to make one, we need to do that first. Now in my story, I have a spot where there is talk about melting.
When the glacier melted.
So when we hear that,
When the glacier melted.
I'd like to have a sun come out to promote the idea of melting. Now in the Object2 layer, I have an empty container here, and this is something that Flash made when I put in something later on. And so you may have this, or you may have an empty timeline, or you may have a container already made. But this is where I want to make a keyframe. So I'm going to press my full keyframe button to make my keyframe. I'm going to label this right away, sun. And I happen to have an end frame or another keyframe at the right spot. If that wasn't there, then I would need to make one. So I would click where I want my container to end, because maybe I want it to end shorter. It's up to you. I'm going to have it end there, so I'd put my keyframe there. Now that I have my container, I must click in it first. So I've clicked in my container, and now I can start to draw. And let's take a look at the drawing tools that we have. So the main ones are the pen tool, and you can press the P key on the keyboard to activate that. There is the text tool. You can press the T key. And we kind of talked about text already. There's the line tool. There's the rectangle tool. Now wherever you see a tool with a little triangle at the bottom right, it means there's more tools that are hidden in the toolbar. So if I click and hold, I can see that there's some other things in here. So there's an oval tool. I can press O for that. And there's a primitive tool for both the rectangle and the oval, which lets you change it a little bit more. And then there's a polygon tool. There is a pencil tool and a brush tool. And if we take a look at the other option here, there's a spray brush tool, which is not that helpful, but maybe you can experiment with that. There is also a paint bucket tool, and if we click on that, there's an ink bottle tool as well. The paint bucket is for filling a space with a color, and the ink bottle is for putting an outline around a shape that's already there, and we can try those out. Eyedropper tool to copy colors from one thing to another, and the eraser tool. Those are kind of the main things. I think that the pencil and the brush are the easiest to use to start off, other than making a rectangle. But let's just go through what they all look like. So if I click on the line tool is based on the stroke color. So I could come here and change my stroke color to, well, whichever. Changing the fill color won't matter for my line tool because a line doesn't have a fill. Now to draw a line, you just click where you want your line to start and you drag your mouse with the left mouse button down to where you want it to end. If we want to draw a rectangle will use a stroke color and a fill color. If you don't want one or the other, if you click on the color chip here, you can turn off having a stroke or a fill. Now if you turn off both, you won't see anything. But if you just do one, so here's our rectangle. Now you can draw any kind of rectangle you like, clicking and dragging. If you want to do a square, hold down the Shift key, and no matter where you drag, you'll always get a square. Or let go of the Shift key and you can get a rectangle. So that's without a stroke. If I go back and pick a stroke color and do the same thing, I get my same rectangle with a stroke. If I do my oval tool, I can make an oval. Again, we can just do an outline if we like. Pencil tool, pretty straightforward. There are some extra settings though. Right now it's in pencil mode, which lets you kind of draw whatever you like, but we can change from pencil mode to straighten mode, which Flash will try and attempt. If you do kind of a wonky line, it will try to straighten it out for you. It doesn't always work great, but it does do the best that it can. And if you do smooth, it's kind of like the pencil line, but it'll try and smooth out anything that you do. So you can try playing with those settings for the pencil tool. Brush tool, again, straightforward, but we do have some other settings. We can change the brush size and we can change the brush shape. Round is probably best, but you can experiment with other brush sizes. And the brush only works with the fill. It doesn't work with the stroke. So we can change our fill color and do whatever kind of drawing we want. You can use it to kind of fill in spaces, but that's kind of also where the paint bucket tool comes in. So if we jump over to our paint bucket tool and we choose a different fill color, we can fill in that space. It doesn't work where there isn't an enclosed space, but we can change a little bit. There's a gap size setting for the paint bucket tool, and right now it's on don't close gaps, but we can try large gaps and we can see which open space it will still work in. So it will close that gap there. Probably won't work there or there, but anywhere that there's a closed space or a small gap. So kind of handy. Then the eraser tool kind of works like you might expect. Drag where you want to erase things. But there are some different settings. So if we change our eraser mode to erase fills, it only erases the fill and not the outline. So that can be handy. There's also erase lines, which does what you might expect. And erase selected fills. So if I get my select tool and I select that fill, and then I go back to my eraser tool, if I drag on the wrong object, it'll only erase what I have selected, which can also be handy. And there's erase inside, which if you start outside it won't erase, but if you start inside it will erase. And you can change the shape of the eraser as well. Those are kind of the main things. Now, with our select tool, we can do some interesting things to any of these shapes. So for example, if I don't click on my line, but I bring my mouse over the line, I get a little curve icon, which means if I click and drag, I can change the shape of my line. If I click and let go, my line is selected, and if I click and drag again, it moves the whole thing. So if you want to move the whole thing, don't click and drag, especially when you've got two pieces, because the fill is separate from the stroke. So I'm going to undo that. If you want to select the whole thing that has a fill and a stroke, double click in the fill and it will select both. You can also click on the stroke just to select the stroke. Or you can click and drag and change it and the fill will move with it, which can be very handy when you want to make something complex. You can also do that to the fill. I can go on any edge of a fill and do the same thing. It doesn't have to have a stroke to be able to do that. If I use my subselection tool or press A on the keyboard, I can get even more fine-tuned. So when I use my subselection tool, I get little squares around the outside that I can click and drag to change my shape. And where I've got a curve, I'll have these Bezier handles which let me change what the curve looks like. So click first, click on any one of the points, and I can get these Bezier curves. That one's a little bit difficult to see with this light green. So you can do some very interesting things with the Bezier curves by clicking on any of the points that you see that make up the shape. And same with the brush. The brush is actually a fill, so we can change how things look. The other neat thing about these shapes is if we have two that are the same color and we move one part over and drop it on top and then deselect by clicking off of it, it now becomes one piece. If I have a piece with a different color and I put it on top and then I deselect and I grab it again, it's taken a bite out of that shape. So you can do some very interesting things by overlapping them, whether they have the same color or a different color. And you can do the same thing with a line. Now because we had that break in the fill, I have only selected part of my line. If I double click, I can select the whole line. So it depends on what, you have to be careful about what is getting selected. But if I bring this line over and drop it on top, and then deselect it, grab the line again, it's broken up my line. So you can do some weird things. Let's zoom back out, and I'm going to select everything in here by clicking on the keyframe and deleting. That's a very fast erase tool. Now I wanted to make a sun. So let's make sure I'm in my container. Easiest way is going to be using the oval tool. And let's make our selection. And since I want to make a perfect circle, I'm going to hold down the Shift key and make my circle. Switch back to my select tool, double click in the fill so I can select the whole thing. Then I can fine tune where it's positioned. Maybe I'm going to have it come out there. I'm going to use the brush tool and I can very easily make my sun even better. There you go. So have fun with drawing.